I just want to thank Mr. Fudge and thank Dave for their comments this morning. I think sometimes although our goal is to be a people who could enter into worship to God at any given point in time, we can let ourselves get distracted, and even on Sunday mornings we come sometimes, and we have a hard time setting our minds right to just be here and to worship, and sometimes we need a little extra help from our leaders to help us kind of get our minds in the right place, and so I really appreciate them taking some extra time to help us do that this morning, and I know it was certainly very helpful for me, and so I just want to thank you. Thank you so much. If you'd like to open to Genesis chapter 3 this morning, Genesis chapter 3. When Genesis chapter 3 opens, the very first person that's introduced to us primarily is what we might call a whisperer. It's now the serpent, the hisser. The whisperer was there close to Eve. And really what he's describing there is something that was very common in ancient culture. There were stories and lots of examples of a throne room kind of place where a king would sit on his throne, and he would listen to the troubles that people would bring him, and there might be conflict, and this side wants this to happen, and that side wants that to happen, but there was always someone who kind of stood back in the shadows, and they would kind of wait for their opportunity, and when they would see it, they would sort of slither up to the king and bend over and just whisper something gently in his ear. That would sort of change the entire thinking of the king, and then he'd slip back into the shadows, and later the king might not even know how he got that idea or where this idea come from. It was just a very subtle, usually self-serving kind of suggestion from the whisperer. In fact, these people were known, sometimes people thought they had the ability to foretell the future because they were so influential that the things they said would happen usually did happen because they're very sneaky, they're very quiet, they're whisperers. And so when you open Genesis 3, we are introduced to the whisperer, the one who sort of slithers up close to Eve to whisper some things in her ear. We're told that he's very cunning. Cunning is the idea that he, you know how water can kind of roll over a rock for a long period of time, and it can take a really rough rock and make it very smooth. It just kind of wears it down to just kind of something bare. That's the idea of cunning. It's someone who has the ability to wear something down over time until it's really exposed and open and understood really well so that you can easily manipulate it. And so this whisperer, he is maybe all in one conversation. It may be literal, or it might just be that this is the kind of conversation that he and Eve had over this long period of time where he's whispering and gently bringing ideas to her mind and wearing her down so that she's susceptible to what he has to say. And that's how we open with Genesis chapter 3. Chapter 2 ended with Adam and Eve in this sort of perfect environment where they feel perfect belonging together, where everything is just right. And we open with the whisperer who is wearing Eve down. And you kind of get the sense of this conversation. It goes really down a slide. And that's really how all of Genesis 3 goes. It all goes as if down a slide. And Eve is just kind of riding down that slide. Adam is riding down that slide. Everyone's kind of riding down a slide that I think by the end of the sermon will feel very familiar to us. It's a slide that we've all ridden down. And maybe you're on the edge of riding down again in our own lives. And that's part of what makes Genesis 3 so useful, is that it is a familiar slide, but Genesis 3 tells us about how we can get off the slide at different points once we recognize that we're sliding down it. And so I want to look at that this morning from primarily Eve, but at Eve and Adam's perspective about going down this slide. When you have the serpent, and he comes up to her, and he starts with something really obvious, right? Did God really say that you can't eat of any of the fruit in the garden? Right? That's an easy one. Eve knows the answer to that one quickly. No, of course not. That's ridiculous. God didn't say we couldn't eat of any of the fruit. He's not starving us in there. Almost all of the fruit we can eat of. And that's, when Satan, you see that he tempts, you start with something really obvious, people know the answer to, and they kind of let their guard down. You feel like you're winning already. You feel like you're kind of on top of him. He's clearly not that intelligent. He clearly doesn't know what's going on. How could he misunderstand God so much to think that he didn't let us eat any of the fruit in the garden? That's kind of how it starts sometimes. Did God really say that lying is always right? Well, no. God didn't say lying was right. We obviously know that. Lying is wrong. Well, but then what if you're lying to save someone's life? You see, he kind of starts with something big and then progresses to something slowly more difficult. That's all he's doing here with Eve. And so she answers him, and she describes the situation. Well, there's a tree in the garden, and we can't touch that one. He said, don't touch that one, but everything else we can eat of. And so he continues on with just something a little bit more subtle. He said that you will surely die. You will surely not die. I mean, really, it's just one word difference, right? That's the only difference. You will surely not die. And so now we find Eve is maybe a little bit confused, and she's trying to remember he said you will surely die. He said you will not surely die. And you kind of get this picture of Eve looking at the tree, and as she looks at it, she's like, well, it does look very good. Like, the fruit looks good to eat. I do want to eat it. And I do want to be wise, like God is wise. God is good. If he is good and he is wise, then it can't be bad for me to be wise in the way that he is wise. And the fruit looks good to eat, and I enjoy looking at it, and I think it would taste good. And she just keeps thinking about it and going over it in her head and staring at the tree and thinking about it. And suddenly she finds that she's pulling it down and looking at it closer, all because, well, maybe I just missed it. He didn't say it's you will surely die, because everything God created is good. This must be good too. It's you will not surely die. And so she eats, and she shares it with her husband, and he eats. And suddenly, everything doesn't seem quite how it was before. Suddenly, she looks at her husband, and she doesn't feel quite as comfortable. She feels a little vulnerable, a little exposed, and he looks at his wife, and he doesn't feel quite like he belongs with her anymore. He feels a little vulnerable, a little exposed, and so they're rummaging and finding some leaves, to cover themselves up, and they're hiding down in the bushes and just trying to be as small as they possibly can until they hear a noise that used to really mean something to them. A noise that they used to long to hear, to love to hear. It says that in the cool of the day, it's the idea of when God's Spirit would blow through the garden, God's voice, the sound of God, the voice of God would blow with that wind. And they could hear him, and they could talk to him, and they could have fellowship with him. They could be close to him. And something that used to be the highlight of the day, every single day, something that they longed for and wanted for, was something that they were afraid of now, something that they were trying to hide from, to disappear. If I can just, something doesn't feel right. Ever since I ate that fruit, if I can just hide down here a little bit longer, maybe he'll go away, and tomorrow I'll know what to do. But of course, God knows what they've done. And so he calls out, Adam, where are you? Now, God knows where they are, but isn't he a God who always tries to give people the opportunity to do what's right? And he asks where he is because he's given Adam the chance to confess, I messed this up. And so Adam comes out, and he's got this kind of pathetic loincloth of leaves around him trying to hide. And he says, well, I heard you. I heard you in the garden, and I realized I wasn't wearing any clothes, and I felt embarrassed about that, and so I hid. And so God says to him, who told you? Who told you that you weren't wearing any clothes? Who told you about clothes? Is it because you ate of the tree that I told you not to eat of? Well, it was her. You gave her to me. And you notice, he blames Eve, but really, he blames God. You gave her to me. She gave me that fruit. I ate it. And so he turns to Eve. What have you done? Well, it was the snake. He did this to me. Notice, she doesn't necessarily blame God, but she's still not taking any ownership of her own choices. It says even that she realized she was deceived. He deceived me. She kind of knows at this point, where she was deceived before, now she recognizes this is not going how the snake said it would. This is not working out how it was supposed to. And so she blames the snake. And from there, we get the 3 curses that God gives to each of those individuals. And you think about what Adam and Eve lost. They traded some really tragic things. They traded in that moment being in the image of God to just simply being like God. That's that's what the serpent says. It says they were created in God's image. And the serpent says, if you want to be, knowledgeable, if you want to have wisdom, you can be like God. And that was sort of a trade down. They traded in that moment some good desires for some evil desires. And they traded belonging for shame. And the curses really are just a reflection of what they had already done to themselves. And so first he turns to the snake, and he tells the serpent, and he says that he is going to be cursed from then on. And you'll notice there's kind of a theme that runs through all of them that concerns the stomach and the head. And that's, they ate the fruit through their mouths, and it went down into their stomachs. And all of the curses kind of have to do with that. There's the fact that he's going to crawl on his belly from now on. He's going to be eating dust, as it were. And that when the time comes, there's enmity between him and the woman, where there'll be the battle between the snake and her seed. It says that he'll bruise his head. It's the idea of an open gash is really the idea. He will basically slice his head wide open, even though he will bite the heel of the seed. And in ancient cultures, they didn't think that snakes that weren't poisonous would bite. They thought only poisonous snakes bit. And so the idea of him biting the heel is a poisonous bite that would kill you. And so, he will poison and kill the seed, but not before his head gets split wide open. And so he curses the snake. But then he turns to the woman. And I think this one is really interesting because of how specific it is. We talked about the head and the stomach. The woman's is all centered around the stomach. And it's her concern about conception. It says your sorrows, that you will be literally, you will carve a path of worry about whether you can conceive or not. That's woman's curse, that the concerns about the ability to conceive, concerns about the ability for the pregnancy to go well, and then pain, difficulty in delivering. And so he promised her a seed. You will have a son who will kill the snake, but at the same time, it's going to be harder for you to even conceive and bear that son who will kill the snake. Difficulties there based on what she did. But then he goes on and he says that her desire, and you think of that, her gut feeling, her desire will be for her husband, but he will rule over you. Now, I think sometimes this gets a little bit misconstrued because when you compare it to how things were before the fall, sometimes we treat the afterwards as if that's the curse. Before the fall, Adam was the head of Eve. He was the spiritual leader of their home before the fall. And so when it says he will rule over you, it's not talking about who's in charge of the home. That's how it was before. That's not the curse. And likewise, before the fall, she desired her husband. That's how God made man and woman, to desire one another. He says that they were made perfect opposites of one another, to complete each other in every possible way. And so there's that spiritual completion, there's the physical, but there's also the intellectual completion and the emotional completion, that man and woman are meant to be perfect opposites, like puzzle pieces that fit together in every possible way. Her desire was to be for him before the fall, just as his desire was to be for her before the fall, because they in a sense, complete one another. So that's not really what it's talking about here either. When it talks about how her desire will be for him, kind of that gut instinct for her husband, but he'll rule over you, the idea is he will lord it over you. He will take advantage of that desire that you have. He will put that to his own selfish purposes. He will know that you desire him, and he will, in a sense, deceive or take advantage of that desire that you have. And really, when you look through history, you see that in a general sense, hasn't that always been the trouble that men and women have had? That women desire to have the security of a home, to have protection, to have all the good things that a husband is supposed to bring for her. And that men have tricked and deceived and lied and said, I love you, and done all sorts of things to sort of get what they want from women and then not do anything else. And that has been the struggle of man and woman since the curse in the garden. And now, of course, we're not saying that literally everyone's husband is going to be a terrible trickster, right? That's women, don't go home. I knew it. I knew that you know, right? That's not what we're saying. It's not always that specific. It's a general idea that this is the struggle, that women will desire to have someone who is their opposite match, but that they will often find that the people who should be that are disappointing to them in big ways and small ways, but they're disappointing to them. That's the struggle that Eve is dealing with there. And, some people would like to say that that's not true of women, and sometimes you can hear them shout it very loudly, and sometimes it's a woman who, maybe she was married before, or her mother had a really bad marriage, and so, I don't need a man. And in a sense that, we're not saying that you have to be married in order to be fulfilled or happy or things like that, but, or really, you look even at the feminist movement today, and it's very different from what it originally was, when it was just talking about the vote or things like that. Today, it has blown into the kind of thing where women don't need men at all, right? We can do away with them completely. A woman can do everything a man can do, and she's exactly the same thing as a man, and she, completely irrelevant. Men are completely irrelevant. And this is not a commentary on who can do more or what. The point is that sometimes when people are yelling very loudly that they don't need something, I don't need that, I don't need that, you kind of wonder, are you trying to convince me? Or are you trying to convince yourself? Why is this so important to you? Because deep down, that's how God made men, to desire a wife like Eve was in the beginning. And that's how God made women, to desire a husband like Adam was in the beginning. But that's all messed up now because of what Eve did. And then God turns to Adam, and here he says something really interesting. He says, because you have heeded the voice of your wife. That word heeded, it's literally the idea of listened very closely to, paid really close attention to. The idea that we get is Adam was there for every moment of her and the serpent's conversation, and he was really listening very closely to what she was saying and very closely to what she was suggesting that he does. And it says, in particular, the voice of your wife. Now, earlier it said that God was walking in the garden. The sound, the voice of God was there every day. Every day, Adam heard God's voice. And on this day, he heard Eve's voice. He knew what both of them were saying. The New Testament will tell us Adam wasn't tricked. He knew what the truth was. But he just chose instead to listen to her voice. Because in the end, he cared more about what she was thinking than what God was thinking. Really, it's kind of the idea, he wanted so much for Eve to like him. He wanted so much for Eve to be for him to be on her good side. She was the pretty face that he would do anything to please her. And so when she said, here, eat this, he knew what would happen, but he would rather be on Eve's good side than prevent Eve from falling into sin herself. And so he listened to what she had to say. And so because of that, God says that all of the things that he does to try to feed the family, and that's, again, the head, the mouth, to feed the family are now going to be very difficult. The ground will produce thorns when you're trying to grow wheat, and ultimately someday he'll go back to the dust that he came from. And she is supposed to have a baby who someday will lead to having the seed that will destroy the serpent. She needs to be able to eat well, to have good nutrition in order to do that. But that's now more difficult because the ground that he is working will be difficult to manage, and it would be that way until the flood. And God lifts the curse after that. And so you've got the serpent, you've got the woman, you've got the man, you've got all the trouble that they have brought on themselves. And then you have God doing something that really is surprising. But before you get there, you get this little moment of Adam doing something. I think it says that Adam named his wife Eve, meaning she's the mother of all the living. And I think it's easy to kind of think of that as a general statement. But it does come between the curses and what God does next. And I think if you put it in context, it really says something about Adam's state of mind at this point. It's almost like he is just really, really upset with Eve about everything that's happened. Because back in chapter 2, when she was first formed, when God took the rib out and he formed her into Eve, Adam is just awestruck by her. And he's just talking about her. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And it says in chapter 2 in verse 23, it says that she shall be called woman. But literally it says this one shall be called woman. The idea is that's her name. Not just generically what we'll call this gender. That's her name, woman. Woman meaning she was taken out of man. In other words, you are a part of me. And I am a part of you, and we are one, and we belong together, and we are something special. He really cared about her. But then, after the curses, he changes her name. Not woman, Eve, mother of all the living. Now, it's not anything against mothers. Eve is celebrated as a mother. The point is, the emphasis is different. Now the emphasis is on her relationship to their children. Now the emphasis is on her relationship to everybody else on earth. No longer is the emphasis her relationship to him. And so he's, in a sense, demoting her to some degree. He's separating himself from her because of what they had done. But we go beyond that to what God does next. And it seems as though he takes some animals and he kills them. It doesn't say that he makes a sacrifice for their sins, but we know that that's what's required for forgiveness, a blood offering. And so it seems very likely that he makes a sacrifice as a soothing aroma to himself so that he can forgive their sins. And then he takes the skins and he makes a tunic, something that lays on the shoulders and kind of goes down to the knees to cover the part of the body that they would feel most ashamed of. And then he has them leave the garden. And he says that they can't be there next to the tree of life. And he says it puts a cherubim there to guard the way. And then if you look closely, it says a cherubim and a flaming sword. Not a cherubim holding a flaming sword, a cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the path into the garden. And you have man and woman separated from the dwelling place of God that he made for them, separated from the home that they were supposed to live in. Their identity has been diminished. That's evident from Eve's name change. Their relationships have been diminished, both with each other and with God. And their boundaries, their responsibilities, their role has been diminished and made much more difficult because they were kicked out of the garden, because they listened to sin and to Satan, to each other, to everything else, before they heeded the voice of God. And so this morning, I'd like to look very briefly at just a couple of application points that we can see when we consider the story of Adam and Eve. And I think it really centers around the idea of what God wants. He wants a holy people, but in particular, he wants a people who would turn to him first. And we talked about the slide. Adam and Eve slid down this sort of slide that I think will feel very familiar to us. And that's really what we see happening here. That there is this point before you enter into temptation, at any point in your life, before you enter into your next temptation, when you're really at the top of the slide. And what happens is, something will catch your eye. For Eve, it was a serpent talking about eating the fruit. And then the fruit, and notice how she thinks about it and longs for it. But before that moment, she was on top of the slide when the serpent was talking to her, and she is questioning what he's saying. Well, no, God didn't say that. And then she gets confused and deceived, and it seems almost as if there's nothing she could do about that. Except we know that that's not how it works. And we know if there's nothing she could do about it, God wouldn't have cursed her. Now, I think the idea is, when she started to have doubts, she didn't have to just pick the fruit right off the tree. There were other options. Remember, God walked through the garden every day. He was there with them every day. Don't you think God would have preferred for her to just wait till he showed up? Hey, did you say we will surely not die? Well, no, that's not what I said. Where did you hear that? Well, there was this snake. Don't you think God would have just taken care of that situation right then if she had just waited and asked, gone back to God's word and see, well, what does God actually say about this? But she didn't, and so she started to slide down that track. And then there's Adam, and he's watching all of this happen. And he's listening to Eve and really wanting her to like him. And so he's considering what she has to say and deciding that that's more important. But there's this moment where he could have said, hold on, let's just wait and just talk to God about what's happening right here. Let's just double check things with him. If God had said don't, surely Eve would have at least considered not eating the fruit. I think pretty highly not considered eating the fruit. She was deceived, and once it was all cleared up, she would have wanted to do what was right. He could have still been in her good graces, but he doesn't. He just lets him slide on down into sin. And then you get to the end when Adam is renaming Eve, and they're kicked out of the garden, and there's all of this despair. And at that point, there's always the opportunity to just slide right into despair and never get back up again. And at each point along the way, God says, wherever you find yourself, stop. Turn to me first. Don't bargain with sin and Satan. If you find yourself tempted, stop. Cry out to me. Turn to me. Ask me for help. Consider what my word says. Look to me first. We will overcome sin. We will overcome temptation. There's that moment when you're thinking about sinning and you're looking at all the people closest to you. Well, what do you think about this? Well, what if I did this? Well, what are you doing about this? God says, stop. Not that it's wrong to ask for advice sometimes, but first, come to me, pray to me, talk to me about it, go to my word about it. Find what I would do. Ask for my help. And then you'll be a good influence on the people you ask for advice from, and not just deceived into doing something you shouldn't. But maybe you've already slipped past that point. Maybe you've already sinned. Maybe you've already messed up everything in your life, and everyone around you is hurting because of the things that you've done. God says, stop. Before you slide into despair, before you fall down to never get back up again, turn to me. Ask me for help. We can overcome this. In the curses that he gives them, there's even little blessings hinted at. Not for the snake, but in the snake's curse, Eve has a hinted blessing. The seed will take vengeance on the snake for what he did to her. The seed will make things right for her. The seed will put things back together.